Whether you want a drawing to feel like it has two figures in the same space, or you just want to use more of a sketchbook page in a visually pleasing way, learning how to place a figure on the page is a challenge. I have a few tips for you in this video. So I have this existing figure in a sketchbook that I had just drawn, but I decided I wanted to use that little bit of extra space off to the left to put the next drawing. So the first thing that I did is I decided where that front boundary of the figure was going to need to go. The furthest most part was actually going to be kind of her hip and where her arm and her leg are overlapping there. So I decided where I wanted that to overlap the figure because that's where they're going to be the closest. They're going to be a little bit here in kind of a V shape overall. So I'm planning where they're going to overlap before getting to anything else. Now I'm kind of making a wild estimate here as to where the other side of the figure is going to go and where the spine is going to go. But I am just really roughly trying to consider where that second figure is sitting so that the bottom of the figure, like the bottom of the butt, is lower than the bottom of the figure on the other side. Because theoretically, if that figure was closer to us than the other figure, it's going to be larger. So the bottom is going to be lower and the top is going to be taller. So I'm just trying to estimate in here that that hip is going to be a little bit lower than the other hip. And then that shoulder, I have around about the same height as the other shoulder because that figure is going away in the distance and is leaning forward. So it's like that kind of makes this figure that is closer to us a little bit taller than the other figure. Hopefully that makes sense. I know where I'm placing the shoulders, that the head is going to end up taller than the other figure. So I tend to like to leave the head for later. I don't like to start off with the head most of the time. So I'm getting that torso blocked in so that it feels about right compared to the other figure. And then I'm going to add the head on top of that. Now, if you would prefer some real-time tutorials instead of sped-up tutorials like this, and if you would like practice life drawing videos and piles of downloadable photo references, you might want to check out my Patreon. I even create real-time tutorials there based on my Patreon members' requests. So take a look at patreon.com/School of Realist Art. Now I'm getting to shading on the figure. I outlined some shadows first to create a plan, and then I just begin as normal shading in those form shadows. By the way, this was a 40-minute drawing done from life here in my studio at School of Realist Art. I have my usual set of materials, which is gray-toned paper, General's charcoal pencils in medium, hard, and white, a kneaded eraser, and a fluffy makeup brush. After getting a contour, outlining and shading in big shadow shapes is always my first step. It's also handy here that since these were drawn in the same session, the light on both figures is coming from the same side because I don't usually change the lighting around in between poses of the model. That really helps this kind of come together and feel like it's plausible that two figures would be in the same space, or at least it feels cohesive. In both of these drawings, the light is coming from our right-hand side and a little bit above. So consider that if you are working from photo references, for example, that if you really want figures to feel like they're in the same space, you want similar lighting. Maybe it doesn't need to be exact, but it should be close and coming generally from the same direction. Once I get my basic block in of the shading on the figure, I start shading in the background, keeping in mind that I'm going to want it to flow a little bit just like the one in the back. So I'm going to, again, layer some shading and then use my fluffy brush to push everything back. If you're curious about seeing how this initial drawing was done, I will leave a link in the description below with a link to that video so that you can see how I created this and get some tips on atmospheric drawing. I considered the most interesting part here to be the shading around the back of the armpit and on the deltoid. I really like that contrast on that shoulder shape with that little cast shadow that's happening behind her arm, a really strong form shadow on the shoulder, and then the contrast with the dark background. So that's my star of the show here. So I started there to really make that shading deeper and more interesting in that area before moving on to other areas. Although I'm not really trying to make it look like there are two models in the same space, I am trying to think about how, in this case, the figure on our left would be closer to us. So there might be some brighter highlights and sharper edges on that figure than the one on our right. At the end, I want these two drawings to feel balanced. So even though the model wasn't there in the first pose, I use the background shading, outline, and edges to think about the page as a whole, and I emphasize the important parts while pushing others back. I create a lot more contrast with the highlights on that shoulder and with a very dark background behind it. I have shading in the background, but less darkness behind the head, where I don't want there to be as much interest. And a lot of the back gets a little bit lost in the shadow. We can see the outline, but it's not as much of a contrast as by that front shoulder. I hope you found this video helpful. If you'd like to see more tutorials, subscribe to my channel and check out my Patreon at patreon.com/School of Realist Art. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.